So we have had a lot of questions on how to trim ornamental grasses and when to trim them. We like to trim ours in the fall, but you can trim them in the spring as well. I mean, this is a pretty beautiful plant in the winter as it's blowing in the breeze when there's not a lot going on in the garden. The tufts when they collect snow, or the plumes when they collect snow, is really pretty as well. But we like to have a clean slate. So let me show you kind of one of the little tips and tricks that we do when trimming ornamental grasses, especially when they're close to a structure like the shed or your house. If this was out in the middle of the garden, we'd probably burn them down, but obviously this is not an option right here. So let's take a look. So having the proper tools, I think, is key when you're doing your garden cleanup. So here is a hedge trimmer. This is a battery operated hedge trimmer, probably about a 2-foot saw on it or so. And another thing is, you'll notice that we bungeed up the grasses. You can do that with a rope or a bungee cord or whatever you might have. The reason we like to do this is because it keeps them kind of all upright, and once you're trimmed, they're nestled into a nice bunch and you don't have to rake up all the grass blades that maybe went flying. So it just keeps them all nice and tight. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this will get trimmed. So Amy's got the hedge trimmer there, and she's going about 18 or so inches off the ground. You can go flat to the ground, whatever's easiest for you, but she's about at 18 inches. And with that electric hedge trimmer, look how easy that is. She just sawed right through it. Now this was a giant grass to start with, so they did break it up. Look at that. Oh, our bungee come undone. But realistically, if that was a rope, it would have stayed all nice and tight together and she could just walk it easily to the compost pile. Although even with a bungee on there, I mean, see, it still kept it all nice and bundled together. So that's going to be quick and easy for her, just to wrap her arms around it and take it off to the trailer with all the compost. Look at that, leaving no remains behind. So this was a very large grass, so they did do this in 3 cuttings. So they bunched 3 sections up. Otherwise it would have just been giant and hard to trim through where there's so much foliage there. So you can do that. You can take bits and pieces of your ornamental grass as you're cutting them down into more bite-sized pieces, let's say. But that is nicely trimmed up now that it's fall. The gardeners have had a very busy day out in the landscape, so let's go ahead and take a look at how far they got and what they trimmed down. So if you remember earlier in the video, here's kind of the circle garden as we call it, and in the middle there was that limelight standard tree that was just full of beautiful blooms. We also had the My Monet Weigela, and I told you we were going to have them trim them up and get them shaped up so that they were a nice globe shaped. And they did just that. Look at that. Remember what that one looked like before? It was so kind of, I don't know, flat-sided, and it's looking so nice right now. We did not trim the dwarf lilacs. These are reblooming lilacs, so they did not trim them. Otherwise, we would have sacrificed our blooms for next spring. So what we'll do is we'll wait till next spring, and if we need to trim them, we'll go ahead and trim them at that point. Looking at the hydrangea, I had showed you earlier different levels as to where it had been trimmed back in previous years. And as I had showed you earlier, those little trims you're seeing there, that was a previous season's trim back, which was more drastic than what happened this year. So this year they're about 12 inches off the most drastic trim that we did on this limelight tree. So by taking off some of that heavy weight, it's just going to have it nice and shaped up again for next summer when it will put on its new blooms. And if you remember, I had said that this limelight tree or limelight bush is a limelight panicle hydrangea that blooms off of the new growth. So even though we did trim it this fall, we don't have to worry about not getting blooms next spring, next summer, because of the fact that they bloom off of the new growth. We also had the roses trimmed back a little bit. This one didn't need a lot of trimming, but let's walk our way around and take a look here. So this one was trimmed back to about 24 inches tall or so. They got rid of all those rose hips, and remember the beautiful blooms, those two have all been trimmed back. Heading out to the butterfly garden, there was a lot of hydrangea blooms going on out here, and they have all been trimmed off. Now, you don't have to trim your hydrangeas like we do here in the fall. Some people like to leave the flowers on for the winter because they really are quite pretty when they catch the snowfall, if you're in an area that gets snow. But we wanted to just get it all nice and cleaned up. So here's the Bobo hydrangea. These are about 3 foot tall or so right now, and I'm going to show you again trimming. So when we did our drastic trim about 3 years ago, and there's videos on this, we took it down to about 18 or so inches. Now this trim they did today, it's about 18 inches or so above that last trim, and that's what you're seeing here. So this is going to just have a nice shape by trimming it. It's not going to be quite as big next year, and that's kind of what I want. I want to keep the size of these hydrangeas just kind of a nice, manageable size. The Miss Molly butterfly bush, we decided to just kind of lightly take off a little bit off the top. So I think they took maybe a foot, 12 inches or so off the top of this plant, leaving what we're seeing here behind. So the thought with this, especially with butterfly bush, they can be trimmed in the fall, but especially being in zone 6A, if we do leave some of this old growth on, it's just going to give the plant just a little bit more protection to take it through the winter. Now, what I'm anticipating next spring is one of two things could happen. All of the new growth could come back at the base. Sometimes butterfly bush act like perennials here in Michigan, or we might see some new growth coming off of the stems that remain. Usually what I'll do, even if I do see new growth coming off of these stems that are remaining, is I'll still trim it back to about 12 inches in the spring, because personally I like a butterfly bush to come back from the base. It just has a nice fuller, tidier look to it, where if you let it come back from these old twigs, sometimes it gets kind of big, gets a little, I'm gonna say scrappy looking, just not as tidy looking. Another Bobo hydrangea, nicely shaped up and trimmed up. Now, I had mentioned over here with the My Monet Weigela that this is a reblooming Weigela. So by trimming this plant back, we more than likely did sacrifice those earlier spring blooms, but it was just getting so big. And even with the trimming that they've done, it's, let's say 3.5 foot tall, and this thing's almost 5 foot wide. I really would love to go in here and just cut out a lot of these big, thick branches to kind of get the plant just a little bit smaller. But I don't know, another year, another time, right? At least they got it nice and short so that it fits into the space in the garden here just a little bit better than what it was doing. You can see all the perennials have all been trimmed back to the ground, so that really cleaned up the space quite nicely. The Firelight hydrangea, you saw it had a gorgeous canopy of blooms on it, and this is about 5 foot tall, so they trimmed it back to about 5 foot, shaped it up again so it's got a nice round habit to it, which this one, honestly, it had a nice habit. It was pretty nice and round, so they didn't take a lot off of it, maybe 12 inches, little less than a third, and that just removed all those spent blooms to clean the plant up. The hosta bed, I think we did see some of this earlier in the video, but the hosta bed's all been cleaned up, all of them trimmed back, so it's looking really good out here. A few things that they didn't trim were Pulmonaria, which is an evergreen, and you can kind of see some of that green there of the Pulmonaria. Also, the Lenten Rose or Hellebore, they are still there. Also, they didn't trim, this is a big leaf hydrangea. This did not get trimmed either because this blooms off of the previous season's growth, so we don't want to trim the big leaf hydrangeas. I got my Alstroemeria trimmed back. Roses, just gave them kind of a nice little trimming, nice little shaping there. It's really quite amazing how many leaves are still on those roses. This was a Bobo hydrangea, and for whatever reason, there's 3 of them out here. They don't get as big as the others in the rest of my yard. Part of the reason is I think that they probably are fighting a little bit for moisture with all of these large trees. I'm sure these tree roots are growing in this space and are taking a lot of the moisture away, potentially from some of the plants that are in this space. Also too though, because they are under these tall trees, they're getting just a little bit more shade than the others that are in the full sun in my garden. And I think that too is just keeping them just a little bit more refined in their size. Monarda, that could have got trimmed down to the ground. So there's a few things that they left, and I'm not sure the reasoning behind it. I'm sure there was a reason, but Monarda could get trimmed back to the ground this time of year. Look how nice those hollies look now that everything else has been trimmed and just kind of have those left remaining. So even in the winter snow, we're going to see these bright deep green, that kind of was contradictive. We're going to see the deep green evergreen foliage on these blue hollies. Daylilies have all been trimmed back. It looks so nice and tidy. I love this time of year when the gardens get cleaned up and just look so fresh and clean. Look at this area. Remember, there was so much foliage going on in this area. There was Rebecca, there was grasses, there was hibiscus, so many things. And just look at that. It's almost like a nice clean slate. The incredible hydrangea got trimmed back to about 3 foot tall. This is an arborescent or smooth hydrangea, so they bloom off of the new growth. So that will be okay for next year. That's going to bloom with no problem. Another Bobo. You can tell Bobo was a favorite of mine when they were first introduced. They're everywhere in the yard. The Invincible Spirit hydrangea was trimmed back to about 2.5 foot tall. Just a nice shaped habit now there. Spirea didn't need a lot of trimming, so they just did a very, very light trimming on that just to kind of shape it up a little bit. And I'm guessing they probably only took maybe 3 inches off of it, so not much at all. Allium Millennium, that got trimmed way back. Baptisia. So what we did with the Baptisia this year is when it was done flowering, I told the gardeners just trim it back. I says, don't worry about it. If it dies, it dies. But I says, I want the Baptisia trimmed back because it essentially, I'm going to back up a little bit. It fills in almost this whole area of the screen you're seeing right now. And there's a lot of plants around here that kind of suffered because of the Baptisia, and they didn't get enough light. Specifically, there is a hibiscus that I intentionally planted right there, and that definitely didn't get enough light because this Baptisia was just really almost growing over top of it. So when I planted it there, my intention was that we would trim this Baptisia back every year, because once Baptisia is done blooming, that's just about the time when hibiscus just start to crack through the ground. So we haven't done that very well, but this year I said we're going to do it. So they trimmed back the Baptisia, and it allowed that hibiscus to really flourish this year, get a lot more blooms and just look a lot better. So the Baptisia, it regrew to probably 18 or so inches, and it started off at about 4 foot. So that worked out really well for me this year. So I was glad that I was able to give that hibiscus a little breathing room by getting rid of the foliage of the Baptisia. Here we have the Proudberry, and I think they trimmed this one in about half. This one's about 2 foot tall right now. And the berries had they were all kind of spent. They weren't fresh anymore. So I said, go ahead and get rid of it. Sometimes Proudberry does last into the winter, but the berries this year, because it was so warm, they didn't stay fresh and good. Nice clean slate again. I had mentioned we were going to trim the clematis back, and they did just that. They removed all of the foliage off of the wall, so that's nice. Trimmed them back to about 12 inches. And now next spring, they'll just start growing up this fence, and it'll be nice because there won't be all that dead growth on the fence because it's been removed right now. The Wine and Roses Weigela, I said we were going to give that a pretty good trim too. And in all honesty, it looks like they just did kind of a light trim, maybe took a third off of this one. So there is some more work for them to do. I might actually have them trim this back to about 24 inches because it's getting too big for this space. Like, it's totally filling in the whole garden and it's almost going over the side of the grass, and I really don't want it that big. And also, if this plant dies, I won't be sad because there's a lot of new Weigela out there that are, in my opinion, just so much more refined in size and just kind of nicer plants, I think. The Limelight Hydrangea, they did a good trim on that. That was over 8 foot tall, and now it's at about, probably 5 foot or so, and gave it just a nice shaping. Nice rounded shaping, so that's going to be gorgeous next year as well. So it looks like this is about where they got with the cleanup of the garden. The Incredible got trimmed up. So when they come back next time, they are going to head back around the house and get all the perennials and such around the house all cleaned up. So that will look all fresh and tidy here too, probably within the next week. Thanks for watching our garden cleanup video. If you have any questions or comments on what we've trimmed or what you are looking to trim in your garden and just aren't sure how or when to do it, please feel free to leave it in the comments below. I am listening to what you're saying, and as you're leaving those comments, when I go out and do more videos, I'm trying to find the plants that you're asking so I can show you how to do those trimmings. Thanks for watching. I'm Heidi from Garden Crossings.